phone, it is a pleasure to welcome back to this program the distinguished professor of English and journalism at Brooklyn College, City University of New York, author of 10 books, including the New York Times bestseller, What Liberal Media? The Truth About Bias in the News, Eric Alterman. Eric, welcome back to the program.
Thank you.
I think, Eric, that I probably first read you. It's quite possible, it seems to me, that I first read you maybe just as I was leaving college or a senior in college about Elliot Abrams 25 some odd years ago.
Well, it's an honor to be considered part of your education, Sam.
Well,
yeah, I wrote about Elliot Abrams. I guess I wouldn't say I'm obsessed with Elliot Abrams, but I sort of am. I was at one time, it's fair to say, back in 1986, 87, I wrote a series. I began writing about him, and then when he was running El Salvador and Nicaragua and Guatemala, I guess you could call that Central America, policy in the State Department under Ronald Reagan. And then he became briefly famous, or rather infamous, because of Iran-Contra and his having lied to Congress and on television. And then he disappeared for a while, showed up again under the Bush administration, the second Bush administration, where he helped undermine the Palestinian elections on the National Security Council. He was put on the National Security Council because it was understood that he would never be confirmed by the Senate, having been convicted of perjuring himself before Congress. And then, briefly, he was expected to be named the number 2 person in the State Department in the Trump administration. He was chosen for that job, and he was lobbied for by Sheldon Adelson, who usually gets what he wants from the Trump administration, and Jared Kushner. But he was vetoed by Steve Bannon for being a globalist. In this case, that doesn't mean Jew, although it helps. But now he's back for the umpteenth time, like an undead zombie, being put in charge of Venezuela policy by our current Secretary of State, Mike Pompeo.
Now, let's. I want to start with his most egregious things that we know of, anyways, and then and you've just laid out sort of like the times he's reared his head. I think the most egregious was his work in Guatemala, if I'm not mistaken, right? In terms of supporting what ultimately was deemed by a UN sanctioned or overseen reconciliation commission in Guatemala as being a genocide. Tell us about that.
I brought up some notes. I can just read you something I've written that hasn't been published yet. It's going to be published in Le Monde Diplomatique in a few weeks, where I went through the main points of Elliot's guilt with regard to Guatemala, El Salvador, Nicaragua, Panama, and then later the Palestinian issue. Do you mind if I read this, or do you want me to?
No, please, by all means.
Okay. Guatemalan General Efrain Rios Montt led a coup in March 1982. Abrams, then Assistant Secretary of State for Human Rights, soon credited him with, quote, considerable progress on human rights issues and insisted that, quote, the amount of killing innocent civilians is being reduced step by step. That's a quote from Elliot. In fact, according to a declassified document, the State Department had already received what it called well-founded allegations of large-scale killing of Indian men, women, and children in a remote area by the Guatemalan army. Even so, Abrams demanded that Congress provide the regime with advanced arms because, quote, progress needed to be rewarded and encouraged. In 2013, however, Rios Montt was convicted by the Guatemalan UN-backed Commission for Historical Clarification of committing acts of genocide, that's a quote, but against the indigenous people of the Ixo region in the Department of Quiche, I think it's pronounced.
Mm.
So while he was defending this regime, it was committing what is now legally determined to be genocide. I'm going to go on. We're still in Guatemala. Promoted to Assistant Secretary of State for Inter-American Affairs, Abrams repeatedly denounced organizations protesting the mass murders perpetrated by Rios Montt, and his successor, Oscar Meja Victores and Vincencio Cerezo Arevalo. In April 1985, Maria Rosario Godoy de Cuevas, a leader of the Guatemalan Mutual Support Group, an organization of mothers of the disappeared, was found dead, and her brother and 3-year-old son, with her brother and 3-year-old son in their wrecked car. Abrams not only supported the government's scarcely credible claim that the deaths had been an accident, but also brought legal action against those asking for an investigation. A New York Times op-ed challenged the official State Department account of the mass murders. It was written by a woman who had witnessed a death squad-style assassination in broad daylight in Guatemala City, which had not been mentioned in the press. Abrams wrote a letter to the editor in a barefaced lie. He cited an imaginary story in a non-existent newspaper to prove the assassination had been reported. That's Guatemala.
And my understanding at one point too, there was a situation where the general had overseen the bringing in of these indigenous people into I think it was a church, and literally slaughtered them and slaughtered all the men by decapitation, and then proceeded to rape all the women. And this is something that Abrams must have been aware of, right? I mean, there's no way that he wasn't aware of this.
Well, he didn't want to believe it. I'm sure he had reports of it, and he chose to ignore them or disbelieve them.
And so,
as we know, the State Department was getting reports on this. Yeah.
Right, and so this, there were similar, maybe not as explicitly established dynamic throughout Central America, El Salvador. We're talking, and then he was.
Yeah, there's a famous case that was brought up by Representative Omar, although she didn't really appear to know what she was talking about, but she didn't get the facts wrong. When there was this famous massacre in a place called El Mizote, very early in Reagan's efforts to try and support the regime there. It was reported in the New York Times and the Washington Post, and there was a vicious effort by the Reagan administration and its supporters, particularly the Wall Street Journal, to try and undermine those reports because they worried that it would. People were still sensitive about Vietnam, and they were worried that reports of a massacre, as it had done in My Lai in Vietnam, would undermine their ability to fight a proxy war there. And again, Abrams insisted that the reports were not, quote-unquote, not credible to a Senate committee, and it appears that the incident is at least being significantly misused at best by the guerrillas. So he was saying that the Times and the Post were the puppets of the communist guerrillas there. In fact, this another Truth Commission, this one in El Salvador, found 5,000 civilians were deliberately and systematically murdered in that place. Most were women and children. Many were raped. You can't imagine a more horrific scene. It's a shame that Representative Omar wasn't more familiar with the facts, because Elliot got all huffy and said he was being maligned, but it's a matter of fact, and a calm disquisition of them, as I've just given you, would have nailed his ass. But
yeah, I guess. I mean, but at the same time, the reason why we're talking about this and that is cut
right.
through.
No, that's been the value of it.
And
absolutely.
I'm
certainly, glad she did it.
Absolutely.
I just wish someone else on the committee had followed up.
Well, it would have been nice, but they probably knew even less, frankly. I mean, let's be honest. I mean, this is not the idea, and I don't want to jump ahead of ourselves, because I want to talk about this dynamic where this guy does not seem like, it's one thing to question why he hasn't been tried, along with the many other, sort of arguable, and I think, Elliot Abrams is on one end of the spectrum of the arguable war criminals that we have had over the years in terms of our foreign policy apparatus. But the idea that he's going up there and he's not going to be challenged on anything. I mean, the guy's lied to Congress, right? Like, he's a proven liar to Congress. And
Yeah.
it,
The lying to Congress is pretty minor compared to the engendering of genocide, I would say.
I agree,
I would say
but he's
that
not been called to account for any of it, and so he comes back.
No. There's two really disturbing things about Abrams' presence in our political discourse, I think. One is that he was chosen by the Secretary of State Tillerson to be the number 2 man in the State Department, and this was treated in the press as an example of a responsible Republican. Yeah, he lied to Congress, but he's not one of these Trump crazies. And second, in this case, Abrams is being vigorously defended by people like William Burns, who was the number 2 person in the State Department under Obama, and Max Boot, who is a leader of the Never Trumpers. Again, a neocon and a member of good standing in the resistance. And his role in the genocide is being ignored. Now, there are other people you could accuse of engendering genocide. Henry Kissinger being the most obvious. I suppose Dick Cheney as well. But we don't have legal grounds for it in any of those cases. We've got legal decisions here, particularly by the Guatemalan Truth Commission. Elliott was the responsible officer in the State Department at the time, and he's on record. And yet no one cares. And this has been well covered. I know this stuff in part because I read it in the New York Times when it happened. And so, yes, the lesson from this is you can commit genocide, or you can help commit genocide. You can engender genocide as a government official in the United States and be treated perfectly honorably by the press, by the Council on Foreign Relations, by the Jewish establishment, where Elliott's a very popular speaker among synagogues. He's quoted almost every day on a website that sends me a news push every day, Jewish Insider. So long as you have the right patrons, so long as you've made the right friends, so long as you go to the right cocktail parties. Elliott is on record saying some of the worst things I've ever heard an American official say and participating in them. And he did it, he did it as an apparatchik. He wasn't a grand strategist the way Kissinger was, or vice president and secretary of defense the way Cheney was. He was just some punk doing this because it advanced his career, and he didn't care in the slightest bit about the moral impact of it, which it turns out is genocide. Just like genocide was committed against the Jews, just like genocide was committed against Cambodians, just like genocide was committed in Africa. We all talk about how, we have museums, we have conferences, we have poems, we have prayers, and yet here's a guy who's in part responsible for it, and we have no problem with him. So it exposes the hypocrisy of the American foreign policy establishment and the Jewish establishment to a degree like nothing else does. I've tried to write that article about the moral vacuum at the center of these institutions, and I haven't been able to do it. I could do it in The Nation.
Right.
I mean, I've done it 6 times in The Nation, but I've wanted to do it in mainstream publications and in Jewish publications, and it turns out to be impossible.
What is, I'm looking at like a series of tweets, ranging from, like you said, Nicholas Burns to the Center for American Progress's National Security VP.
Right, that one was taken down.
That was
for the record.
Okay. Well,
that was deleted.
Okay, yeah. So the public proclamation has been removed, but the sentiment, I imagine, remains.
Very well said, gentlemen.
What accounts for this durability? What is? We saw this.
It's a club. It's a club. The only time the Council on Foreign Relations has rebuked Abrams was when he called Chuck. Secretary of Defense.
Right. Chuck, yes, I can't even remember his name now, but he was Secretary of Defense under Obama.
Right,
Hagel,
and Abrams called him an
anti-Semite.
Abrams called him an anti-Semite. Chuck Hagel, right. And Abrams called him an anti-Semite. in order to oppose him because he was considered to be unsympathetic to Israel. And then the head of the Council on Foreign Relations, Richard Haas, said, we're not really comfortable with this, that he's gone too far.
All right. Well, I mean, we could go over to the period where he was brought in to...
including genocide. But if you attack people who were also in the club, that's not cool. There's that famous story of Larry Summers telling Elizabeth Warren that her ideas are fine. They can debate them, support them, or disagree with them. But when you start attacking people who are with us, then we can't deal with you. And so that's what Abrams did, and that's what he was rebuked for that one time. I guess he didn't understand that Chuck Hagel was also considered a member of the club, having been a senator. But anything else you do, it's not. As long as you're in the club, people are going to protect you. And if you start attacking people like this, then you're going to be out of the club. I mean, there have been people who have been in this club who have been written out of it because their criticism became, too pointed.
Yeah, I mean, I guess, so are we just left with that? I mean, it's stunning, and in many ways, it seems to me, to the extent that we have a vacuum of a genuine left foreign policy, right? One where whether you want even center left, really. The Democrats seem to me have there's been this, I guess they call it the blob, and I can't remember who made that they created that term, but that's
Barack Obama.
Was it Barack Obama who talked about the foreign policy blob?
Yep.
He certainly didn't seem to get outside of it.
Let me pick up on this, Sam. I know what you're saying. I agree. I began my straight out of college career working for the Institute for Policy Studies for a man named Richard Barnett, who was a leader of left-wing foreign policy thinking. That's what I wanted to be when I grew up. I also greatly admired a Harvard professor named Stanley Hoffman, who was considered sort of the anti-Kissinger at Harvard. And I thought, originally, I was going to make my career doing the same thing. Barnett it was pretty mainstream, even though he's quite left-wing. He was then the New Yorker's foreign policy writer, and people took it seriously. But you're right that the left wing has attenuated in this position. It's basically embraced Obama's foreign policy, ended up being sort of old-fashioned conservative policy. Now that the right wing has become so crazy, the old-fashioned conservatives are the liberals. There was a moment, Obama, he picked his battles, and I would have picked different battles. The battle he didn't pick was taking on the foreign policy establishment until the very end of his tenure, when he talked about the blob and he got a little impatient with Israel. But when Obama ran for the Democratic nomination, he ran against this whole foreign policy establishment where we have to intervene everywhere and where military power is all we have to sell. And he accused Clinton of representing it. And at the time, I don't know how well this was known, Richard Holbrooke was running Hillary Clinton's foreign policy team. And he was telling everyone, if you work for Obama, you will not get a job in the Clinton administration, the Hillary Clinton administration of 2008. And he scared away everyone who had these ambitions, with a few exceptions, one of them being Samantha Power, and another one being a close friend of mine named Sarah Sewell, who together did most of Obama's foreign policy writing during the administration. And so a bunch of people, including some people associated with the Center for American Progress, took a risk and stuck with Obama against Hillary in the hopes of rethinking foreign policy from a liberal perspective. And Obama sold these people out when he chose Hillary Clinton to be Secretary of State. He vetoed a few of her choices. He wouldn't let her bring Cindy Blumenthal into the State Department. But basically, he said the moment, the opening he had created, he decided was not a battle he wanted to fight. And so the blob took over again. And towards the end, he tried to fight it a little bit. Ben Rhodes writes about this very well in his book, but that was a really lost opportunity. There's an article in The Nation, current issue, I believe, about my friend Matt Duss,
Yes.
who is Bernie Sanders' top foreign policy advisor. And Matt, first at the Center for American Progress, where he left. I used to work with him there because he felt uncomfortable with his Middle East policy, which he was in charge of, sort of. Then at the Foundation for Middle East Peace, and now in Bernie's office, he has been not only trying to rethink strategic ways to counter the blob, but also to come up with new concepts. And I'm critical of Sanders in a lot of ways, but this is the best thing he's done, I think, is not only challenge the precepts of the foreign policy establishment, but also try and rethink what new liberal internationalism would look like.
Eric Alterman, always a pleasure. Thanks so much for coming on, man. I really appreciate it.